Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Going Global, brought to you by Moneycorp Bank, where we'll be diving into the world of cyber risks, past, present and future. Moneycorp Bank exists to help businesses, individuals and banks thrive internationally when it comes to moving money across borders. So I'm Andrew Harrison, Head of Group Risk and Compliance at Moneycorp, and I'll be joined today by our esteemed guest, former Director General of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Martin Clements. Martin, welcome to the webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today.
Oh, well, thanks very much indeed. It's good to be here, Andrew.
So with that, I'll go straight into our first question for Martin. So there's far too much out there about the risk from cyber. Can you cut through this and give me a feeling for what the actual threats that most ordinary businesses might face are? And perhaps if you could give us a little bit about how you think that threat is likely to evolve over the coming months and years.
Andrew, I will do my very best to do just that. I mean, it's quite a challenge, of course, because there is such a vast amount of information out there, as you point out. A lot of it is misleading, a lot of it is very colourful, and a lot of it is simply not relevant to the kind of people that I expect will be listening to this course. So I am going to have a go at seeing if I can pull the key issues out of it for our audience so that they can get a little bit of help with focusing what they need to. I mean, I used to do something which I called Hack of the Day. I got a little bored myself with cyber pundits coming on the air and giving you a list of 20 things to be terrified of. I mean, there's always something to be terrified of, and in a certain sense you should be, to the sense being that you should take this seriously. But just go on to the BBC app or the Financial Times and you'll find something eye-catching there. So today there's lots of stuff about Russian hackers. There's a strange, what sounds like a code word, solar winds, but it turns out to be a business capability, and a really quite shocking story about how a nation state might be contributing to breaches of security for commercial and for governmental organizations. But look, I think, Andrew, myself, that this is a little bit misleading. Nation states do matter, but I don't think they're the major threat to businesses, or at least not directly. See, I think you, as a business, you can be threatened directly by a nation state, but that's only going to happen if you're involved in some sort of high-end negotiation with an unscrupulous and highly competent nation state when it comes to offensive cyber operations. And frankly, that's pretty rare. The difficulty is that nation states, some of them, operate what amount to safe havens for the people who develop the commercial, the criminal software that threatens all of our listeners. If those people didn't have that safe space, then in my opinion, at least, there would be a great deal less to worry about. I mean, there are other ways in which nation states matter. They matter because there's a simply shocking amount of movement of skills and techniques between the government sector to the private sector. I know of one major nation state that a couple of years ago suddenly realized that a lot of its own hackers were actually making a great deal of money outside working hours, doing exactly the same thing on behalf of, well, ultimately criminals who were selling the techniques on, and they were being used against businesses. It can start to matter to businesses when the strategic tensions around whose infrastructure is going to get used in, for example, 5G, start to spill over into supply chains and markets. And all of you may very well have concerns about how the American-Chinese tensions are going to play out. And I think you should. But of course, there's a limited amount that you can do about that. You have to pay attention to it and think about how to mitigate those risks. But let me pull back from all of that. the truth of the matter is that the major part of the threat to all of you is just the huge volume and variety of threats that criminals are using against businesses like yours. At the moment, I might highlight ransomware. That's stuff that encrypts your hard disk drives, makes your data unavailable to you. I might highlight CEO fraud, which is where you have the clever confluence of cyber techniques and traditional fraud. And in fact, I believe that that's the technique which actually causes the greatest losses. And Andrew, I think you asked me how it was all going to evolve as well. And let me say a few words about that. In the end, I guess we'll get to the point where there are a set of global norms. States at the moment, I think, I'm afraid a lot of them are hypocrites. They are getting too much advantage out of their cyber programs, and they're not really ready yet to do that big deal to really press down on cyber as a risk. I think businesses are going to respond with a lot more outsourcing of technology and the complexity of defending it. At the moment, that will be into public cloud offerings, and I'm sure that's the right thing to do, by the way. We'll almost certainly find ourselves accepting more and more that there's no perfect defense, that we'll see cybersecurity as something of a tax on digitization, from which, of course, we get so much more advantage than we ever have to spend on our defenses. We'll act more not as if there may be a cyber attack on us, but that there will be, and we'll prepare ourselves better to deal with it. I think we'll probably get better at working within our sectors, cooperating with people who are otherwise our commercial rivals to defend the common interest. A couple of tactical thoughts. I think we'll see some evolution in criminal techniques to attack people when they're working from home. That hasn't really happened much yet. There's a lot of talk about it, and existing techniques have been used, but I suspect we'll see some new techniques along with things like infiltrations of remote meetings, webinars like this one. I guess we're headed towards quite a big clash over the payment of ransoms, because clearly someone is paying ransoms, otherwise ransomware would not be exploding in the way it has done, a 7-fold increase incidentally between 2019 and 2020. And if you want a slightly more exotic thing to finish off my list of predictions for the future of the cyber threat, I think there's going to be a bit of a machine learning war between the criminals who use machine learning to develop, from their perspective, better cyber tools, and cybersecurity organizations that will use machine learning to come up with better defenses.
So clearly this is an area that businesses and the CEOs really need to be paying some attention to. So given that threatening backdrop, what would you be saying to business leaders about how their organization should respond to these threats? So perhaps, what would be your top 5 or 10 or however many you think applicable to-dos that ought to be on every CEO's mind right now?
Yeah, look, I mean, if I was just going to have one, and when I was still in government, a few of us agreed we were going to go out and give this one message. It's this: emphasize it's mostly pretty simple. It's about doing the basics. It's a banal threat, and a prosaic response can deal with most of the problem. Get the basics right, like teaching staff not to click on the wrong link, having the right basic technical security in place, and patching your software in a timely manner. Well, this deals with a lot of the problem. So that's my sort of one key lesson for chief executives. But let me just give you, I'll come up with a slightly longer list, and pick any from those you'd like me to go into a bit more, perhaps, Andrew. I guess the first thing is, do you really understand the threat? I mean, if you've taken the trouble to understand what really is out there threatening you. I mean, I spoke in answer to your first question about that, Andrew, but if you're a business leader, have you worked this out? I mean, both generically, if you like, and specifically to your organization. And look, what gives you confidence in your answer to that question? I mean, who told you this was the answer? How do they know? So really be sure that you've got a right-sized version of the threat to your organization. Once you've done that, have you got the right team in place to manage that threat? I mean, this is all new. You may need new skills. You may need new departments or new quite senior roles. The CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, is a relatively new concept in the business world, and it's still evolving. But have you got the team in place that you need? Then, and this might be what most people jump to first, but you can see why I've come to it third. Have you got sensible defenses in place? And they must cover people, process, and technology. So it's never just about technology. It's about the people who use it and the processes that tie all of these things together. And I think of there being as a bit of a Goldilocks zone when it comes to cybersecurity. You mustn't underdo it, you mustn't overdo it. So have a look around you, have a look at what your peers are doing, what people you admire are doing. Neither put too much into this, that would be bad for business, nor put too little into it, that clearly would be. The next point for CEOs is, do you check those defenses? Do you probe them? Do you stand outside your organization? Do you pay somebody to do that? You will have got something wrong. Find it before the bad actors find it. And if whatever penetration testing or red teaming or whatever you want to call it doesn't actually throw up some hole in your defenses, honestly, try harder. Keep trying harder until you break something and then fix it. Be glad you found it. If everything did go wrong, though, a CEO should be asking her or himself how well they would manage the incident. I know of there's a very instructive incident around an aluminium smelting company in Norway called Norsk Hydro. Now, it's not really for me to say, but I think Norsk Hydro might say that the way in which they were initially attacked was pretty straightforward, and they might have prevented it. However, what was unusual about Norsk Hydro is how brilliantly they'd end up with the incident. And I reckon they came out ahead of the game. I have this idea you have two chances with cyber. I mean, the first one is not to get hit in the first place. But the second chance, if you do get hit, is then to manage it in such a way that people say, well, my goodness, well, that could have been us. It was, in fact, them. Thank goodness it was them, not us. And goodness, they handled that well. They must be a professional organization. And then on my short list of questions or points for the CEO, there's something about culture. Have you set the right culture around this? A culture in which people care about information security, about cyber risk, about not having the business disrupted by something avoidable. And I like to think in there there's a willingness to forgive people when they get things wrong. Remember I said something about penetration testing and phishing tests and the like. I think everyone deserves a second chance when it comes to this. A first chance to learn. And then after that, yeah, you expect either the defense to have been fixed or the person to have learned their lesson. So I describe this as 2 strikes and you're out. And, you know, if this is about CEOs, then I say to all of them and any who are listening to this call now, set a good example, ladies and gentlemen. If you set a good example, then you can expect other people to as well.
So Martin, the last of those to-dos was really about the CEO's own behaviours. Would you like to expand on that? And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, for you, what leadership looks like in a more digital age, perhaps compared to what went before.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which, look, you know, Andrew, you know that, of course, the truth is that leadership is leadership, and it needs to be adapted to new circumstances. I actually do believe there's something fundamentally different about the age that we're in to do with pace. However, I suspect that it has long been the case that transformational leadership, adaptive leadership, that all of these things under different names were pretty decisive in earlier generations. It's just we called it something different. So what I may be doing is just pulling out those lessons which 100 years ago, somebody in an evolving steel industry would have rolled their eyes and said, well, yeah, that's actually very much the same for us now. But anyway, never mind. I think there's There's an irreducible issue about leadership from the very top, though. If you work in an organization where the very top leadership are profoundly convinced by the need to change, the need to transform, the need to take advantage of these new opportunities, it has a completely different feeling inside that organization compared with one where the very top leadership regarded as a necessary evil. And I guess I've described this as very close to genetic in my own experience of highly impressive and top leaders. You know, it's about what gets them out of bed in the morning. Is it, by one analysis I once saw, is it more looking after an inheritance? If you like, polishing what has been given to you by your predecessors? Is it about the adrenaline of the deal of the day? Is it about being on top of those numbers and making sure that the business is driving forward right here, right now? Is it about a legacy, leaving something to the generations that come after you, taking a slightly longer term view? Now, of course, it's always going to be about all of those. I just think that the digital age has mixed those up a bit. So what about the question of timescale? What are you thinking about? So I mean, I was asking government from time to time to justify the cost of programs, to which my answer would be, well, hold on a second, over what timescale do you want to justify this? If you're asking for a return on your investment this week, then you're going to be disappointed. If your question is, how is this going to play out over the next decade? I've got huge confidence that this has got to be done. I mean, I don't know, for example, if you look at the process of renewing your tax disc, not that you've got a tax disc anymore. I really admire the people who went about that transformation in government from some ghastly paper process that involved you going to a post office to something that it just takes seconds. And they ask for feedback each time you do it. And I always send them a sort of big heart or the equivalent of that you can online and just say, look, you know, genius, well done, all of you. And part of the reason I do that is I knew the people who did do it and I thought they did it brilliantly well. And you end up with these wonderful, simple processes. But if they'd been asked to do that and justify the benefit, you know, over a month, they couldn't have done it. So over what timescale are you talking about? What is your time horizon? Getting that right is one of the keys to leading transformation in the digital age. And of course, that links to the question of motivation and reward. If as shareholders or a board or remuneration committee or whatever, owners, you're not motivating your leadership to act over the period that it makes sense when it comes to leading transformational change, then you won't get it. I think of the example of the BP CEO, or the former one, Bob Dudley. And you may recall that he was savaged, poor man, in the media for his paycheck. And you may think it's a bit odd for me to describe him as poor man. Well, remember, he was brought in to deal with perceived and doubtless real weaknesses in the security culture inside BP. And he was given performance measures against which he would then be judged and he would be paid. If he were to change that, he did that. He got paid well, but BP in the meantime was not as profitable and people didn't like it. So you will get what you reward to some extent. And I think in the digital era, that what we should be striving for is what I saw with a US admiral. I went into the cabin on their aircraft carrier. On the wall, there was a little sign saying what the admiral's job was. And I asked if I could have a closer look. And the admiral got it down. And she said, and it was written down there, that her job was to look after these young women and men and give them the tools that they needed to do their jobs. And I love that, because what it wasn't was, you know, engage and defeat the enemy. It was what I perceive a top leader's job was, looking after the people and making sure that they had what they needed to do their job. Digital age leaders need that kind of gesture, things people remember. They should be visible in their digital leadership. They should make it a feature of their communications. It should be apparent from which teams they visit, who gets praised, who gets promoted, and why. If you set out the criteria for advancement with an organization to include the leadership of digital programs, and you then actually reward people who do that and the opposite, then that is what you'll get. And those leaders, they'll always see the issues in the round. They won't just see it about technology. And I've got a little checklist that I go through myself, and attentive listeners will probably be able to pull it out from my answers to your questions, Andrew. So I talk about leadership, first of all, thinking about leadership in terms we're talking about. I talk about information, intelligence, situational awareness, understanding what's going on around you. Then about D for defense, thinking about your defenses, making sure you've got everything in place. And then finally, advantage. You're only doing all of that in order to achieve business advantage. So make sure that you're actually doing that. You're making yourself safe and secure so that you can take more advantage of digital technologies. Check everything, check that everything is working properly, and then repeat, go round that cycle. When it comes to the risks, though, the digital leader really needs to set a good example. I mean, I know I've touched on this already, but this means that they shouldn't be widely known to be negligent in the way they go about looking after their phone, doing their own emails, doing the training. You and I both have fairly senior roles at Moneycorp, and I know you have just done the online training. Well, I've just done the online training. Now, I have a portfolio and I do it at half a dozen different places, but I still regard it as being a deeply important thing to do to set an example. Well, take, I'm a great believer in exercising for the day that there's a serious cyber incident. And, the digital leader, the CEO, should be leading those exercises personally. I would say once a year, something like that. They do it for 3 reasons, by the way. They do it in order to learn lessons, which they will. They'll find there's something they didn't know. They do it because if it's important to them, it's important to everyone else. And they do it because would you really want to wake up one day, find there've been a cyber attack, then be asked by your regulator when you last personally led an exercise and not be able to answer that question? And look, just a final thought on leaders in the digital age about the benefits. I think there's no getting around the fact that a rounded leader in 2020, 2021 is going to be someone who is personally curious about technology and how it works. The sort of person who is an early adopter, who goes and buys the next new thing and tries it out. They'll turn up at the hackathon, let's say, but not just because they've got to be there, but to go and look over the shoulders of people and find out what they're doing. You reveal yourself by what you do. Are you prepared to set up and sit on a technology advisory board? Perhaps even, and it may sound a bit weird, but for very top leaders, go and learn something. Go and learn a little bit of coding. Go and do something yourself. It's just a thought. Anyone I know who's ever done that has always found it hugely beneficial. And of course, then they'll talk about it a lot and others will get the message too.
Thank you for that, Martin. I think an important point you mentioned there was around digital advantage as well as the risk from digital. Now, obviously, I know you spent a lot of your time with HM government leading digital change. So I wonder, what has that taught you about sort of the same task, leading that digital change, but in the business world rather than at a governmental level?
Well, I mean, the first thing, Andrew, it taught me is actually very much the same. I've been out of government for 5 years now, and I think that's the first point I would make to business leaders and indeed to my former colleagues leading transformational change, digital advantage. Well, they're kind of the same thing. But it does take me back to an interesting talk that I attended in government from somebody, I think they were at Deloitte, in fact. And what he said was that he believed it was pretty much hopeless for most governments to try and keep up, because it was not in the DNA of governmental organizations to be able to move as fast as the minimum speed necessary for survival. And he predicted a great crisis. And I must say that landed very heavily with me, as I think it should with a lot of CEOs, because I'll make one long-term prediction, which is that the biggest killer of businesses is not going to be the post-COVID recession, geopolitics, or even cyber. It's going to be the failure to keep up. And I actually think in the medium term, that is the biggest risk by far to most businesses. And it's hard. It's hard everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. And anyone who thinks otherwise isn't going to be successful. But let me make a few observations that I hope will be of some help. And it's based on decades of my own work in this area. The first one is about what you should be using to change. I think it can get very confusing because, there are all these technologies out there. What should we be embedding in our business? And I have buckets that I think of different technologies as sitting within. First one is the bucket where you've probably already been too slow to adopt that technology. And at the moment, it's cloud. Cloud is the example. There's a wonderful thing called Amara's law, named after an American gentleman called Roy Amara. And it's this, that we tend to overestimate the significance of a technology in the short run and underestimate its significance in the long run. And you certainly could apply that to cloud. Everyone gets excited, then they don't do enough, and then it catches up with you. But take, for example, mobile technology. We've really seen that remote working come into its own. And you might have heard the phrase, oh, it's as if we moved from 2020 to 2030 in a weekend. And the truth of the matter is we actually moved from 2000 to 2010 in the course of, well, not a weekend, but a few weeks. The technology has been around for a long time. And that's the first bucket, the stuff you should have got at already. And in a way, it's the easiest, it's the most mature. But also mature is the second bucket. It's mature, valuable, and you should be busy implementing it now. I'd say machine learning. I prefer that term to artificial intelligence, but machine learning, so very many processes can be improved by this using perfectly standard, straightforward implementations of commercial software. The third bucket is the be ready to pounce bucket, stuff that is close to mature, close to a tipping point, and you should be ready to grab it, to be a fast follower, if you like, when it comes along. Distributed ledger, blockchain, for example, there. And then my final bucket is stuff which is definitely real, but it's not clear yet when it's going to become something of relevance to business. And the classic example there, of course, is quantum. Quantum, I, for a long time, I wasn't convinced by. I'm utterly convinced now that this is real, it will happen, and it will make a very important difference. So think in terms of buckets, ladies and gentlemen. What other thoughts might be helpful? Well, think of innovation as an ecosystem. You'll hear people say, oh, you should do it using a laboratory. Oh, you should do it with hackathons. Oh, you should do it by offering prizes. Oh, you should do it with big programs. Oh, this, oh, that. Well, actually, it's a bit of lots of different things. Innovation in the operational front line is another one which can be absolutely great. But manage it consciously as an ecosystem with effort between different ways of doing it. Try everything. I think there are some utterly key principles about leading the programs that follow on from successful innovation. I'm going to give you a few examples. My own list is actually rather a long one, but I'll pick these ones out for today. There's something about communication, under-promising and over-delivering. Be so careful not to buy your way out of short-term pressure with promises you then have to live up to. Under-promising and over-delivering is far, far better. Mention it quietly, test it thoroughly, and then deliver it in a way which exceeds people's expectations. What that does is it builds trust and support for the future. Get people in charge of the individual projects who are really excited by them. There's a difference between leadership and management when it comes to projects. The leadership of a project matters as much as the management. people who really understand what the benefits are for the business of making this change and who can communicate with the business should be leading these projects. They find it a lot easier to get their own message across if they've got great benefits metrics. Now, it's one of those terms of art from the program project management world that can turn you off, but just making sure you've got some numbers around it so you can demonstrate to people over what time period this is going to make what impact. Well, it's good for you to understand whether your pet project is working, but absolutely it's vital for your audiences, many of whom will be skeptical, if not all the time, at least some of the time. And having the ability to come back always to a set of numbers that everyone's bought into and say, well, remember what we said, this is what we've got to, this is what's already happening, and this is what will happen by the time we've finished. And then, my final thought, although, Andrew, you're right, I could bang on endlessly on this subject alone. Healthy, simple governance. At its best, governance is not a burden. It's something of a metronome pulse in long-term change activity. That heartbeat, the actual meetings of the program board, in a way, they're the least important thing, except for the fact that they actually happen. And they drive all of these behaviors and expectations in the meantime. Healthy, simple governance.
We are getting towards the new year, and as well as being a time for resolutions, it's usually a time for predictions. You spent a career advising ministers about risk. So what risks ought to be on the business leaders calendar for 2021?
Yeah, well, managing risk is not quite the same as making predictions, thank you. Prediction is a mugs game, so I will answer this question on the clear understanding that we're getting close to Christmas, and therefore, particularly in 2020, a slightly more light-hearted approach, at least for a moment, might be worthwhile. Although I'm not sure I can do light-hearted beyond being willing to engage with making predictions. I'll give you one prediction then, with all of these caveats, from the fields of medicine. Well, it's very topical. Geopolitics, and I'll start with cyber. So first of all, on cyber, I think it's actually been a long time since we've had one of those big global attacks, which is not an especially threatening technique, but which is extremely widespread. And I'm thinking of NotPetya and WannaCry a few years ago. What they turned into was what you might call a stain test of business cyber defenses. In other words, if you had been doing the basics right, you didn't get hit by any of those. If you hadn't been doing the basics right, then you did. Now, if this happens again, I predict it probably will be something escaping from government circles, which is what it was on those two occasions that that I mentioned. So look, everybody, if you remember one thing from this talk today, keep up that patching, because you don't want to get caught out by Martin Clements' 2021 prediction turning out to be true. Okay, so that's my cyber prediction. Geopolitics, there's been a big event, a very big event, change of a US president with, I think it's uncontroversial to say, an extremely different style. And I'll suggest that when it comes to relations, for example, with Russia, which is highly pertinent to questions around cyber, I think that there will be a reestablishment of a very mature, low-key, dare I even describe it as boring, strategic relationship between Washington and Moscow, in which things get thrashed out. But I think there'll be a bit of tension as a new equilibrium is established around what is regarded as mutually acceptable and unacceptable in the use of covert capabilities like cyber. So what I guess I'm saying is that will get better after a year or so, but that in 2021, you might see some sparks flying around cyber in Russia. On geopolitics, by the way, I do join the consensus and say that what drove the Trump administration around China is going to drive the Biden administration as well. Although of course, the terms of engagement will be different. I think that the Biden administration will be highly technocratic and professional when it comes to its diplomacy with China. And that is hugely to be welcomed, I guess, even though the fundamental issues won't have gone away. And then look, my final prediction, I can't finish this without mentioning that as this is recorded, we're still in the throes of COVID-19. We may have the end in sight. But what have we learned? And what prediction would I make from that for 2021? Well, look, what we have learned is less than you might think, I argue. Could we deal with the next COVID better? Oh yeah, no, we deal with it extremely well, I imagine. We've even, I understand extraordinarily, we've made progress on potential approaches to annual vaccinations for the common cold. I mean, that's a huge plus if you think about it. But look, I got a theory about human beings, which is that we are extremely poor and we have not been changed by COVID-19 at dealing with low frequency, high probability, high impact risks, which COVID-19 or a pandemic of this kind has been for a long time. Famously, Bill Gates spoke about it. Famously, it's been on the UK National Risk Register for years and years and years. Now, if we'd really learnt that, let me give you a thought experiment. Antimicrobial resistance, in other words, are antibiotics running out? We know that they are, and we know that if we have a sudden crisis around that, the medical impact will be far greater than COVID-19 ever was. And yet we also know that the cost of dealing with that risk is, well, of the order of 50 billion US dollars. But have we done it? No, we haven't. If you are looking for signs that we have really learned to be better at dealing with the class of risk I described, have a look at antimicrobial resistance and see if we do something about that. But look, actually, my favorite prediction for 2021 is that it will be a lot less exciting than 2020. I award 2020 a C- at best as a year. And I'm hoping, I must say, Andrew, for at least a B+ from 2021.
Thank you, Martin, for a fascinating insight into the world of cyber and digital risk that you provided for us today. I'm sure this conversation could go on for a lot longer, and I know you've got a lot more insights that you could provide us, but unfortunately, our time today is up. So thank you once again for making the time to chat with us today.
Andrew, well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm sure you can tell that I enjoyed it too.
Moneycorp Bank exists to help businesses, people, and banks thrive internationally. If you're a business, individual, or a bank, and you wish to have us assist you with your international payments or to look after your foreign exchange currency exposure, please get in touch. Likewise, if you enjoyed our webinar today, please like and share it on social media once it has been made public. The next episode of Going Global webinar series will be our final one, which will be hosted by the CEO of Moneycorp Bank, Michael Azzopardi, joined by special guest Albert Isolus. So we look forward to seeing you then.